Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Belpod, the podcast dedicated to Belarusian football. We'll kick off today with news of a change of coach in potash mining country, before encouraging the returned damsel to start warming up her vocal cords in preparation for Smorgon's seemingly inevitable relegation. In part 1 we'll also take a look at some of the predictable transfer speculation currently swirling around one of Belarusian football's hottest properties, and reflect on some encouraging displays by the national team in recent weeks. Part 2 is all about Vitebsk, before we finish with our usual preview of this weekend's standout fixtures. Hello again, and really, to be honest, John, there's only one place to start this week, isn't there? And that's the goings-on at Shakhtyor over the last few days, following on from a disappointing defeat in the crucial weekend matchup with Bate.
Well, that's right, Liam, and of course it's little surprise to anyone, I think, that Sergei Gurenko was relieved of his duties after an almost entirely miserable 57 days in charge at the Shakhtyor Stadium. I have to say, I think he was sold short by some of the players in his brief time there. Clearly, Gurenko has shortcomings as a manager. He's not regarded highly by fans or journalists in Belarus, but I do think some of those players simply weren't doing it for him. And I have to say, the way that they lost that game, Gutor's error just defies belief. The more you look at it, the worse it gets. And I think after a defeat of that nature, then there was only one outcome for him. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I slightly take exception. I know you're not a big fan of Gutor, and neither am I. I mean, yeah, it's a mistake. It's a goalkeeping mistake, clearly. But it's one of those balls, I think, where it's played in to the far post, and if nobody gets a touch on it, it could go straight in. If somebody gets a touch on it, so to me, it's the worst kind of ball you could get having the season that Gutor is having, to be honest. Yeah, he probably should have dealt with it. You could say his defenders should have dropped back in and cleared it. I thought they were too negative, John. I just thought they went there for the point. I could understand that. They probably felt as long as we don't lose, we've got 3 games in hand, we'll be okay. But I don't know, the conditions again, absolutely hosing it down, wasn't it, in Borisov? But still, just felt that, I didn't feel like they went there with a particularly positive attitude. And that probably is Gurenko's fault, isn't it?
I agree with you. Just to round off the Gutor thing, it's the 92nd minute. You're almost there in achieving your team's goals. And as an international goalkeeper, allegedly, you stand and let a ball across the corridor of uncertainty just drop past you. I'm not having it. Sorry. A goalkeeper should come out and punch that away, which he's prone to doing, or tip it over the bar. Do something. You've got to intervene. But the broader picture on Gurenko's tactics, you're right. And we can compare it with Shakhtyor's extraordinary 2-2 draw up there last season against Kirill Alshevsky's Bata, when they really dug in and gave a great performance. There was a controversial equaliser, as you remember. But the performance that they gave there in 2020 and that one on Saturday was night and day. And that, taken with the fact that Bata knocked them off the top of the table, clearly spooked the powers that be at Shakhtyor into pulling the ejector seat lever for Guria and getting someone else in.
And you quite rate the guy they brought in, don't you? He seems to be much better thought of as a coach than Gurenko ever was, which begs the question: why didn't they get him in when they?
Well, he was available when the vacancy came when Roman Grigorchuk departed. The issue apparently was that they needed a manager with a European visa for the European games, and presumably, I don't know, but presumably Alexei Baga didn't have it at that time. Alexei Baga won the league as manager with Bata in 2018. He won the Lithuanian Championship with Žalgiris Vilnius last year, seeing off a strong challenge from FK Sudova. He went to FK Aktiva in Kazakhstan after that, and that never worked out for him. It was just one of those moves that looked bad from the off. And I think he will just settle things down at Shakhtyor. He commands instant respect. He had a great playing career. He won't take any nonsense from the bigger egos in the dressing room. And I think, to be honest, given that Roman Grigorchuk had that team running like a well-oiled machine in his time there, then he left. And there's just been 2 months of complete chaos. And I think they just need someone respected like Baga to come in, to settle everything down, to focus on the task at hand, which is capitalising on the great position in the championship. And he's exactly the sort of character to do that, yeah.
And I suppose Grotchuk towards the end, the wheels did start to fall off, didn't they? For him, although with the European games and everything, things started to. But I don't think there's any doubt, is there, John, that they're the best team in the league. I mean, they've got the best players.
Absolutely.
So realistically, they ought to win. Obviously, they've just played this evening, haven't they? And they've regained their place on the top of the league with a fairly routine victory, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they beat Energetic 2-0. I don't think it was a vintage performance. But compared to some of the guff that the Shakhtyor fans have been served up with in the 7 games that Gurenko was in charge, I think already, even though Baga's only probably had one training session and a motivational speech with them, already you could see that there's a little bit of impact there. And I think they'll get stronger again in the closing third of the season. And indeed, a few of the journalists are complaining that, the championship isn't going to be very interesting now because Baga's just going to come in and close it off and Shakhtyor will come to their senses. And that does seem the likeliest outcome at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of ground for the other two still to make up. I mean, I can't let this section of the show pass without mentioning dear old Shakhtyor Umarov. I mean, I know you would say it was a fortuitous goal, but what a year he's had, really. When you imagine where he was, perhaps not this time last year, but a bit earlier, wasn't he? He was Stowberry. He was a substitute for Energetic, picking up pocket money, wasn't he? Driving the lawnmower, and now look at him scoring the winning goal in one of the biggest games of the season. So great stuff. And what I love about Umarov is he just keeps coming back for more. He's not by any means a finished article. I would say three every 4 crosses are not great, but it doesn't seem to deter him, does it? He just keeps going. And I think that was a decent ball in, which Guto will beg to differ. I think it was a difficult ball for him to deal with. I wouldn't say that Umarov meant it, but it's still into a decent area in the 93rd minute of a massive game. So I was delighted for him, to be fair. But we would still think probably, as you say, that Bate and Dinamo, who still have to play Shakhtyor, don't they? But still, even if they were to beat Shakhtyor, obviously with the games in hand that Shakhtyor have, you'd expect them still to win the league. Unfortunately, from a neutral perspective, we want it to go down as it did last season to the last couple of weeks, don't we?
I agree with you about Umarov. I think they'll monetize him within the next year and sell him on somewhere. And the difference between Umarov and the Yak, and they came to Energetic together, was that the Yak is a much more sensitive person mentally, I think. He fancies games or he doesn't. He drifts in and out with his performances. Whereas Umarov does seem to be quite consistent with his levels. And he is a brilliant dead ball specialist. I really enjoy his free kicks and that cross at the weekend, intended or not. He first came to prominence when Energetic actually beat Bata up there and he scored an extraordinary goal in that game. So, yeah, it's good to see his development. In respect of Shakhtyor not winning the title, you'd have to feel that they lose these important fixtures against, Dinamo. They've got Gomo to play, I think, as well. Still, they'd have to lose all those. And for one of Bata, Dinamo or Ruch to win every single one of their remaining games. And it's a pretty unlikely scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right, I suppose, John. But I'll keep dreaming. I'll keep dreaming of a final day showdown like last year. As probably at the bottom of the table now is looking. Obviously, Sputnik have gone, so that's one team that won't be in the Shishan next year, and the other one looks like Smorgon now, doesn't it? Really, unfortunately.
Yeah, they're done. They had a desperate last throw of the dice last week, getting rid of Gerashichenko to another role within the club. They appointed a young man from Russia, Anton Mikashenok, who I'd never heard of, who seems to be some sort of Russian Ian Cathro, a tactics geek without much by way of playing experience. He's a journalist by trade, and I'm afraid we all saw the results of that on Sunday at Neman Grodno, where they were eviscerated 5-0, and it's impossible to see Smorgon surviving now.
However, what is interesting, and I'm sure you've taken close note of this, John, being a massive fan of Martinovic at Slavia, is that they've actually picked up a win and a draw in the last couple of games, haven't they? Quite unexpectedly, I would suggest. Especially, I suppose Dinamo Brest, to be fair, are gone, aren't they? They live out on their feet, don't they? And obviously, Sedko leaving is also disappointing for them. But yeah, they look like. Do you think they might catch one of the teams above and avoid the relegation playoff? Is that a feasible objective now for Slavia?
It is, of course, and that's what they've got to aim for. They want to avoid that playoff if they possibly can. I think they've brought in a couple of new players recently, and Francis Nair's been in great form, and Francis Nair was absolutely dominant in the game at the Bresky the other weekend. And I think when he's in the mood, not many defences in Belarus can live with him. As for Martinovic, regardless of the results of the season, I'll not be changing my mind. I don't think he's the manager to realise the potential in that club, because Mozar's quite a wealthy town with the oil refinery. The club does have money. It's relatively stable. It's got money to buy players, and he's made a complete pig's ear of this season. They're unfit. He's never known what his best team is. And for me, those are two pretty fundamental failings of any manager.
So if they do catch anybody, who do you think they'll catch, John?
I would say FC Minsk, but then that position has changed too this week in the game of 34-dimensional chess that is Belarusian football, because the Airport League manager, Mr. Shecherbachenko, who was brought in surprisingly at the beginning of the season, the poor man's ill, actually, joking aside, and is undergoing treatment in Moscow, so he's very honourably resigned. And the talk is now that Vadim Skripchenko will come back to continue the work that was bizarrely interrupted by a previous chairman. And FC Minsk have lost their last 6 on the bounce, I think. And they're a collection of iron filings without a magnet. And the best magnet they can get is Vadim Skripchenko. So let's see if he comes back. Sergei Kuzminich is in charge for the game with Sliutsk this weekend at the Tractor, which is a vitally important relegation game as well. And Brazovic and his guys will be going up there very confident of a win, having seen how poor Minsk have been in recent weeks.
I watched Brazovic's team last weekend, as you know. I think I might have mentioned to you once or twice before, John. I'm a bit of a fan of FC Gomel. Don't know why. Maybe you've got that in your head by now. I have to say, last weekend I was absolutely salivating over Solovei's second half performance. Not so much his first half performance; a bit off colour first half, but I don't know if you've seen it. The bit of skill in the run up to him scoring. I think it was the second goal, his first goal. Unbelievable feat, and then obviously a beautiful finish for the second of his 3 goals. And then it all kicked off, didn't it, after that with Solovei and a few days after that? Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, that was an outstanding performance. The ABFF named him Player of the Round for that performance. He was absolutely on fire in the second half against, admittedly, a modest defence. But it emerged on Monday through Nikolai Khadasevic that Solovei had signed a pre-contract agreement with Shakhtyor Soligorsk. And it made sense because, Darbo won't be there next season. And if they've got Skavish and Solovei up front, that would actually be quite a good international front pairing, never mind club front pairing. But one of the Gomel players, Ruslan Yudenkov, took to his Instagram to denounce Khadasevic and say that his story had 0% truth in it. And it seemed to me a little bit over the top. Okay, you can say there's no truth in this and Mr. Khadasevic is mistaken. But he really kind of laid into him in his Instagram story, and in the context of Khadasevic having been threatened with violence during the international break by the national team coach. I think it was over the top. Vladislav Tatur today has said that Solovei is interesting to Shakhtar and has an offer from them, but nothing has been signed. And he's also interesting unknown clubs in Russia and Turkey. So this is going to be the saga that runs and runs and runs for the rest of the season. Where's Solovei away to? And actually, as we said in a previous episode, he's a loyal boy, and I would certainly laugh quite a lot if he was still a Gomel player and a slightly better salary next season.
Yeah, I'd love that too, I have to say. But it was depressingly predictable, wasn't it, that Shakhtyor link? It's just like as soon as you get a good player that doesn't play for Shakhtyor or possibly Bate, that's where they're going. And I suppose it happens in a lot of leagues the same. Yeah. I still don't understand this mentality, John. I mean, again, Turkey and Russia. Does anybody in the Western world look east at all? for players. I'm sorry, but Solovei, for not a huge amount of money, I can't believe he couldn't do a job in at least the Championship in the UK, for instance. He's a very, very good player. I know he's about 25, 26, but you just never hear these players linked with Portugal or Spain. You can imagine, if somebody came along and offered Gommel €1 million, then, they take it straight away. And to me, that's an absolute snip. And I always felt the same with Darbo, who probably still will end up going to Poland or Turkey or Russia. I just don't understand that. I don't understand why. I know perhaps
it's a short career, Liam, and it's money. It's plain and simple. These players are highly powered athletes. They're totally dedicated to football. They live and breathe it, and they know their career, if they're lucky, is about 15, 16 years at the top level, and you've got to maximise your salary. And Russian clubs and some Turkish clubs can throw enormous amounts of money at these players to play in a league which isn't the Premier League or Spain, but still a very good standard in respect of Belarusian players, let's say, moving here. And I know that we tried to start a rumour unsuccessfully last season that Vitali Lisakovic was going to Barnsley. But the problem is Brexit. These guys now need to be top internationals playing 75% of the time for their country. Solovei isn't, and he doesn't have that background. Therefore, it's very difficult for any club to bring him into the UK. And when there's players that are just as good, probably available for a little bit more money from perhaps countries that are easier to bring players in from, then, it's the path of least resistance for many scouts, isn't it?
I guess so. I mean, as long as that is the motivation behind it, and I do understand if that is the case. I just wonder whether they're not even looking. Do you know what I mean? And I just think, I know we love the league. I know that obviously we accept it's not the greatest league in the world. Maybe that especially gives me slightly rose-tinted glasses in terms of the best players in it. But I just look at something like Solovei and I think he is a very, very good player. I don't care how weak the Belarusian league is in comparison with, let's say, the top 5 leagues or even one, Portugal.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. In an ideal world where he could come here, he'd be a very good player in the Scottish Premier League or top-end League One, bottom-half championship in England, without doubt, absolutely.
Talking of internationals, you mentioned there Kondratiev's slightly inappropriate behaviour towards Kadasevic. But actually the internationals overall, which have all happened, haven't they, since we last recorded, although it was 3 defeats, actually, they emerged with quite a lot of credit from them. And we did say before those started that we were pleased that they were throwing in some younger players, and it was by no means a disaster against pretty strong.
That's right. And leaving the politics aside and the behaviour of certain officials, I think on the park, they were most impressive against the Welsh, and they were very, very unlucky to lose that game. I think Belarus deserved at least a point from that game. And had politics been normal and the game been played in Minsk or Gomel, maybe they'd have won it. I thought the performance was excellent. I thought Vitali was superb in that game. I was also really impressed by Klimovic. He really stepped up to the mark, I felt, in that game and caused the makeshift Welsh defence a lot of problems. You have to say, I was also really impressed with the Belgian performance. I mean, I was looking at that through my eyes, having sat with you on Discord through the shambles earlier in the year. And they put up a very creditable performance. And it's one of the only games of football I can remember where the losers are celebrating as though they're won. And Roberto Martinez stalked off down the tunnel at high speed, looking like he'd eaten some Kazan carp that hadn't agreed with him. So I think the Belgians were unimpressed by that performance, and the media in Belgium didn't like it either. But they got the points, and that's all that matters in these tricky games for teams at the top of the international game like the Belgians.
So obviously our eyes now turn to November, don't they, John? Will we be allowed to go? Do we want to sit amongst the home supporters cheering for Belarus? Will we survive if we do? We're very hopeful. We'll certainly be getting something out there if we get any indication whatsoever, any encouragement whatsoever that we could take a hardy band of Belarusian football enthusiasts that we've cultivated over the last 50, 16 months. We'd love to have a Bell Pod day out there, wouldn't we, John? But we'll wait and see what the world's
Yeah,
looking at that point.
it would be ideal. And I'm going anyway because I lived in Wales for a while in my younger days, and I've still quite a few friends in Wales, so we'll be able to get a ticket through them. And I certainly fully intend on going, come hell or high water. So let's see.
I think that's about it for part one, isn't it, John? And
Probably.
that means that we could carry on talking forever, couldn't we? But people are starting to switch off now. So we'll move on to part two instead. Welcome to part two. We've thrown you a little bit of a curveball this week. We know that you've just got really, really used to always a bit of a break from me and John. So we thought this week you'd listen to another 5 minutes of John. So sit back and enjoy another 5 minutes of John if you haven't had enough of John already. I won't speak, I promise, but then I'll gabble on after it. He's going to tell us all about Vitebsk, the town, and also the team.
Vitebsk, in the northeast of Belarus, is one of the most fascinating and deeply cultured cities in the country. When you read about Vitebsk in football literature, they're always referred to as the Northerners, as though it's a city a little bit apart from the rest of the country, a kind of Belarussian Carlisle United. Vitebsk has been around since 974, but it became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 12th and the 13th centuries after a brief period as an independent principality. It was given away as part of the marriage of a daughter of the leader of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 15th century, by then, it was moving towards incorporation, which happened in the 16th century. Napoleon conquered Vitebsk in 1812 and actually spent one of his birthdays there during his campaign against Russia, before he was booted out and humiliated at another Vysheshaya Liga city, Obriusk, later on in that particular campaign as his retreat across Europe began. In the 19th century, Vitebsk was part of what was called the Pale of Settlement in the Tsar's time, namely that part of the Tsarist Empire where Jewish people were concentrated. Following the fall of the Russian Empire at the end of the First World War, Vitebsk began to be associated for the first time with what was to become Belarus later in the century. It was around this time, this extraordinary time at the end of the 19-teens and the beginning of the 1920s, in the first uncertain and contested years, that Vitebsk became for a couple of years almost a mini Vienna in terms of art. There was a remarkable realistic portrait and genre painter called Yehuda Pen, who was kind of the Vladimir Belyavsky of Vitebsk art at that period. He nurtured many talents who went on to become globally famous as painters, most notably Marc Chagall, a young man who passed through Yehuda Pen's private classes, and later went on to become one of the best-known modernists who spent most of his career in France. You may remember also last year a rather strange shirt that Vitebsk wore in the Belarussian Cup. This was designed by their former player, Daniel Chalov, who worked with the Historical Museum of Vitebsk and the Jewish Centre there to produce a football shirt based upon a painting or a propaganda poster, actually, by the modernist artist El Luzhetsky. Well, Daniel Chalov, of course, later went to FK India and Serbia and is now back in Moscow, I think, concentrating on the fashion business that produced that shirt. Another link between Vitebsk's history and the club is the town hall, which appears on Vitebsk's badge. This is a lovely neoclassical building in the centre of the city, built in 1775, and it's been on the football club's badge for at least 25 years now. Let's move on to football. Vitebsk have been around since 1960, but they never really, we have to say, pulled up any trees in Soviet football, being mostly in the third tier and very occasionally having not very memorable forays into the second tier. Since the independence of Belarus in 1991, Vitebsk, in keeping with many clubs at the time, went through a bewildering number of name changes before, in the late 1990s, reverting to the obvious and uncomplicated Vitebsk FC. Vitebsk, in Belarusian terms, have been a middling club. They've mostly spent the years of independence in the top flight, although they do flirt with relegation and occasionally fall through the trapdoor, for example, losing the relegation playoff in 2011 to the now defunct Partizan Minsk, before returning in 2014 with a promotion playoff victory against Dnepr Mogilev. What's interesting about Vitebsk is that if they're consistently middle of the road in terms of their league performances, then their squad is one of the most stable in the Vyshchaya Liga. I was looking as part of my research at the Vitebsk Cup team that got to the final in 2019, only to be turned over 2-0 by Shakhtyor Solovei. But looking through the Vitebsk team, we see very familiar names. Dmitry Gushchenko in goal, Artem Skitov, the captain nowadays, Vanderson, the Brazilian defensive midfielder, Matvienko, the experienced winger. These are names that are still at the club and still playing an important part there 2 years on. Vitebsk is a football club that inspires loyalty. If we look at the career of Artem Skitov, he's a one-club man, a Belarusian under-21 international. Skitov has been there for an extraordinarily long time, having signed from the Vitebsk 19s in 2008. Vitebsk have had one of their better seasons this year. Really, they're the best of the rest, having faced significant challenge from Dynamo Brest, with Neman Grodno currently with their revival coming up a little bit behind them. They're sitting in 6th and 36 points, and it looks like that with a good set of results towards the end of the season, they should hold on to that place. The regular goalkeeper is Dimi Gushchenko, a bit inconsistent, but clearly a real local character. A defence featuring Julio Cesar, the elegant Brazilian centre-half, very easy on the ball, alongside his countryman Vanderson in defensive midfield. Where Vitebsk are really interesting is the young midfielders they have, the Roman Lisovskis, the Evgeny Krasnovs, young Alexander Xenofontov, who scored a couple of spectacular goals in the last few weeks. And when you add that in with experience, the likes of Ruslan Tverov, the free-scoring centre-forward up front, alongside experienced winger Anton Matvienko, and you have a side that should be easier on the eye, perhaps, than their Vitebsk nil moniker might have had you believe earlier in the season. When it's possible for us all to visit Belarus, I have to say, for my own interest in art, but also to see the town itself, Vitebsk will be one of my first destinations, I think, and I'm hoping that it will coincide with a game at the city central stadium that isn't the kind of 0-0 draw we saw against Slutsk at the beginning of the season. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you for that not special guest, John. It's nice to hear, as always, from you about your dulcet tones about an interesting place. It's been a long time since the Smorgon roundup that you gave us. So, no, great to hear a bit more about it. I have to say, as I say, every time somebody does this, I really hope I could go there someday. But more about the football than the actual town itself. I mean, to be fair, we were really negative about the start of the season, weren't we? And they were incredibly dull to watch. But you have to take your hat off to them, don't you, really, what they've achieved on very, very limited means. I mean, they look like they're going to finish sixth now, don't they, which is fantastic.
It's an extraordinary performance, as I alluded to at the end of my piece. I think Evgeny Chernyukin's done an incredible job there. Clearly not a very likeable man. I mean, calling out some of his own players in post-match press conferences, and I think belittling one of the Brazilians after the win against Minsk last weekend. And I always, managers that belittle players are difficult to warm to. But you can't argue with the results he had. Yes, we characterised them as Vitebsk nil in the first part of the season, and I think one of the few times I've ever heard Motti, dear Christopher, getting close to angry in one of his commentaries was that scuffed penalty against Sliutsk in a 0-0 draw, and Big Carlos at the back. And that was the worst game I've seen this season. It was appalling. But I think after that game, Tatur famously said that he'd rather watch the cats asleep in the yard or the traffic lights change than watch another Vitebsk games. But they've really turned around, and interestingly turned around since Diego Santos went to Ukraine. And they've looked really strong in the last few games. So you can, whether you like Chernukin or not, whether you like Viteb's style of play or not, you can't argue with the results. And if they do finish sixth, it'll be their highest finish for quite a few years.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because every time they didn't really seem to be making use of Diego Santos. He was on the bench a few times, wasn't he? And he seemed kind of a very frustrated figure. And I just felt they should be getting more out of him. I felt that was all the coaches felt. But you don't know, do you, what goes on behind the scenes? And maybe he was actually quite a pernicious influence. And maybe the team is more united now he's gone, even though for me, he was by some distance their best player. But they have got some good players as well, isn't there? Again, we tended to be, I certainly tend to be blinded by their rather negative style of play. But having watched them with a slightly more, neutral perspective in recent weeks, they've got some really nice players, haven't they?
They do indeed, and they scored some absolute pearlers against Dinamo Brest in their last home game. Two of those 3 goals were really beautiful team moves. Ruslan Tverov's the guy they're trying to build around. Rasadkin's experience, but not really a prolific goal scorer. Matvienko is their most important player, the experienced Ukrainian winger who was their Sergei Yazinski signing. Where they're weak, I think, they're good at the back with Skitov and the big Brazilian. They're weak in goal. I don't rate either poor Dimi, who's a wonderful character, but is liable for at least one clanger every other game. And they've got Sirocco there as well, who Chernukin doesn't seem to rate, even though I think Sirocco's a better keeper. And of course, their wonderful flair player now is Vanderson, the other Brazilian star they have, who's great to watch and very calm player. He's kind of the heartbeat of the team, in a little bit like Khachaturian was at Torpedo before he got injured. So yeah, they're a really tight group and really well organised.
Thanks for that, John. Give them a chance, I say. I know we spent 6-7 weeks writing them off and saying, please don't watch them, even if you're desperate. But they're at Energetic this week, I believe. So, any Energetic fans out there, give them a chance.
And you remember that game, Liam, where you and Dan and I were watching, and it was one of the most chaotic 3-3 draws I've ever seen in Molodechno in spring 2020. I can still remember that game, completely crazy. Vitebs were terrible for most of it, but somehow got a point at the end.
Indeed. So that's all about Vitebsk. We're going to leave part 2 right there, and we'll be back in a minute with part 3. So as always, part 3 is dedicated to looking ahead, and we've got a full set of fixtures this weekend. Apart from, of course, Sputnik not playing Slavia, which is a handy 3 points for Slavia in their quest to avoid the relegation playoffs. What stands out for you in the fixtures this weekend?
Well, the 2 big ones at the top of the table, aren't they, Liam, are Shakhtyor, who take on Neman, and Ruch, who take on Bata in front of their 7 fans, and 300 people bust in to make an atmosphere. So I think that's going to be a key game, actually, and a tough game for Bata, and one that they really have to win.
Indeed. And at this point, I think it would be a really good idea also to mention another significant fixture that's happening this weekend. It's a lot close to home, but I think there's no point in me talking about this one, John, because you're the one who's been heavily involved in its organisation. So I'll hand over to you for this.
All right. Well, again, we're just got a bit of a Berchtesgadenian monologue from me this week. But it's a game between Belarusian diaspora in the UK and a team of Scottish artists, which I've been involved in putting together. It's organised by the People's Consulate of Belarus in Edinburgh. They're the organisation that supports Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the opposition in Scotland. And we are playing for the Alexander Ivulin Cup. Alexander Ivulin, as everyone who listens to this programme will know, is the Krumkachi footballer who's currently imprisoned because he has annoyed certain powerful people far too much over the course of this season. So we're highlighting Alexander's case and the case of all the other political prisoners in Belarus at this time. By playing this game. And there's a program which I've shared on our Twitter and on our Discord if you want to read more about it. And most importantly, if you want to, having listened to my scathing remarks about various quite good footballers over the course of this podcast, you can see me flop around in goal like a taser jellyfish on the live YouTube stream. So it's on at 1 o'clock on Sunday if you fancy a laugh before falling asleep behind the Sunday Express after your roast beef and potatoes.
He's kept that from me, listeners. He's kept that from me completely. I mean, I was going to watch it anyway, but I wasn't expecting an appearance from Blackwood in goal. That's fantastic stuff. So yeah, please do support that. Obviously, it's going to be a great occasion. I think there'll be shirts on sale afterwards as well. Is that the intention?
Yeah, there's people. It's through the Pendle website. People will know Pendle as suppliers of non-league and schools football, and we've worked with them to produce a set of kits for the Belarusian diaspora team, and they're available to buy online. They're only 20 quid, so they're very affordable for a modern day football shirt.
Good luck with that, John.
Thanks,
don't let in too many, please. But obviously, it's fantastic.
I will inevitably let in many, and then you can invite Alexander Gutor on as your guest to roast my performance for 20 minutes.
Hey, there's a thought. There's a good reason to get fluent in Russian. I imagine Alexander doesn't speak much English, but no. Obviously, it'd be great if you could watch that. And we hope you enjoy your football this weekend. I did again this week, looking at the same results. There's one thing you can guarantee with this league, isn't there, John? There will be a couple of surprises. One of the best decisions I've made all this season is not entering that prediction competition because I share the results every week, and I know full well that if I win it, I'd be right down the bottom.
Yeah, my team are sort of floundering in mid-table, and the board are having serious conversations as to whether to dispense with my services at the moment. So I need a big result there this weekend.
But to be fair, it does make it hugely exciting because there's about 4 points between first and sixth place. And if you get about 5 out of 7 any week, you catapult up the league about 5 or 6 places.
Absolutely.
So thank you to all our listeners for continuing to keep going with that. Obviously, it's been lovely to have that support every week. And I mean, it's actually great not being involved and taking part because I can just enjoy everyone's predictions and go, oh, really? And then obviously look at the results. And as soon as when they were getting one at Torpedo last week, the first thing I did was look at the spreadsheet. Oh, wonder who predicted that. So yeah. Great. So, and of course, nobody did. I think one person did. Maybe one person did. But then they predicted like Dinamo Brest to beat whoever Dinamo Brest were playing. Was it Slits? Wasn't it?
No, we're playing Slavia, which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
You are teaching again, aren't you? That brain feed is only possible for a teacher.
Not quite working, no. But anyway, everyone predicted a home win in that. Every single person, apart from a couple of draws. No one predicted a away win. Don't we just love Belarusian football for its unpredictability? Anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking part as always, John. Good luck on Sunday.
Thank you. And thanks for listening, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time.